Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar with Prezi. My name is Arwen Heredia. I am Prezi's Content Marketing Manager and your moderator for today's session. We are here today for the Storyteller's Edge, Communication Secrets to Sell, Lead, and Grow. It features Carmine Gallo, Prezi's first ever Storyteller-in-Residence, an amazing keynote speaker, best-selling author, and all-around awesome business coach. This is an extra special webinar today because we will be executing it using Prezi AR, so we're very excited to share this with you today. Just so you know, if you have to hop off for any reason or want to revisit this content later, we will be sending you an email in the next day or so that includes a recording of this session, along with some other valuable assets that you can use to make a great story out of your current corporate narrative. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started.
Ideas matter. Your ideas matter. In the knowledge economy, the information age, it's not enough to have a good idea. You have to be able to advocate for it, champion it, and convince others to buy into it. As the forces of globalization, automation, artificial intelligence combine to disrupt every field, every job, every career, the ability to communicate your ideas persuasively is the single greatest skill that will give you a competitive edge. At a time when ideas matter more than ever, those who can persuade, inspire, and ignite the imagination of others are unstoppable, irresistible, and irreplaceable. Mastering the ancient art of persuasion, combining words and ideas to move people to action, is more relevant today than at any time in human history. Your ideas matter. Let's make sure you get them across successfully. I sat down not too long ago with Daniel Pink. He is a New York Times best-selling author and a legendary TED speaker. Pink says, like it or not, we're all in sales now. All of us. Regardless of what field we're in or what title we hold, we are in the business of persuading one another, persuading another person to do something. That's why communication skills are more critical today than ever. Pink and his team of researchers examined how people spend their time at work. Here's what they found. In To Sell is Human, you have a wonderful quote that I think summarizes so much of what I think, and I've used the quote quite often. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. Can you explain? What did you mean by that?
You know what I mean is something very simple, that if you look at the ground truth of how people spend their time at work, a huge portion of it is selling. Maybe not selling a product or service, but persuading, influencing, convincing, cajoling, and we did a really interesting study on this that showed people are spending around 40% of their time on the job doing this thing that's kind of sort of like selling. And if you just think about that, 40% of your time, 40% of an hour, 24 minutes. 24 minutes of every hour of every day of every week of every year, and it's become fundamental to our ability as individuals, as leaders, as entrepreneurs to succeed.
What about those people who say, I'm a teacher, I'm a manager, I'm a project lead, I'm not in sales?
I would say to them, as gently and generously as possible, you're wrong.
Pink is right. I've interviewed scholars and scientists, CEOs and billionaires, Navy SEALs and NASA astronauts. I've spoken to leaders, managers, sales professionals of the world's most admired brands, and I've asked the question, what makes a great leader stand out? What qualities do they share? They are all remarkably effective at selling their ideas. Look, if we're all in sales now, how do we do that? How do we sell our ideas? Here's the best part. You already know how to do it. Storytelling. It's the single best tool available to persuade another person. A surefire way to win the war of ideas. Why? Because as humans, we are hardwired for stories. Storytelling is not something we do. Storytellers are who we are. To understand just how storytelling will help you in your career, we need to step back into the past, the distant past, thousands of years ago, when humans gained control of fire. According to anthropologists, fire marked a very important milestone in human development. It allowed our ancestors to cook food. As a result, our brains got larger. We got smarter. As basic language skills developed, fire served another purpose. It artificially extended daylight. Instead of hunting and gathering when the sun was out, our ancestors sat around campfires. And what did they do while they were sitting around the campfire? The same thing we do today around a campfire. They told stories. Professor Polly Weissner is an anthropologist. She estimates that storytelling made up 80% of what you're seeing here, those fireside conversations that our ancestors had. Stories informed, educated, and inspired. Isn't that what we're trying to do today? Think about it. How do you sell a product? You have to inform the customer, educate them, and inspire them. How do you motivate a team? How do you pitch a company? You have to inform, educate, and inspire. We've been doing this for thousands of years. We're not that much different today. Yes, the tools of communication have changed. We use Prezi presentations and not cave drawings. But our ancient brains actually have not changed that much. They haven't changed at all. Richard Branson says storytelling is one of the most important skills a person can develop. He says if you want to succeed today, as an entrepreneur especially, you have to be a good storyteller. And get this, Branson says his team comes up with their best ideas when they're gathered around a campfire at his home on Necker Island. And what do you think they're doing? Exchanging stories. Yes, we are wired for story. In a moment, I'll show you how science proves that we are. But for now, let's stay in the past. Let's travel to ancient Greece, and we're going to hang out with a really smart guy, Aristotle. Aristotle created the system of logic that underpins today's computer technology. But for our purposes, he's important for another reason. Aristotle is the father of persuasion. He believed that our ability to change another person's way of thinking could unleash human potential. In Aristotle's view, public speaking, it wasn't something just nice to have, it was fundamental. If you watch an inspiring speech or a presentation that really touches you emotionally and sparks your imagination, it's likely the speaker used techniques that Aristotle introduced more than 2,000 years ago. Aristotle came up with the elements of persuasion, what he called appeals. In order for me to convince you of anything, I need to do three things. One, I need to establish ethos, which is credibility or character. If you don't trust me, you're less likely to buy into my argument. My actions have to back up my words. I can also confer that ethos or credibility through third-party endorsements. That's why we have resumes, where we list our accomplishments, our titles, degrees, certifications. But as all of you know, that's not enough. I need to have what Aristotle called logos. That's the appeal to reason. I need to make a logical, structured argument that leads you from where you are now to where I want you to go. If I'm selling a product, this is where I would talk you through the features of the product. I would explain how my product, my service, my company will solve your problem. I can make a logical argument. You have problem X. If you solve problem X, you'll be happy. My product, Y, will solve problem X. Therefore, my product will make you happy. A logical argument. My argument might make all the sense in the world. Will you buy it? Not necessarily. Persuasion cannot occur in the absence of the third and the most important appeal, what Aristotle called pathos. Pathos is emotion, storytelling. Now, this point is really critical. Emotion is the fastest path to the brain. As humans, we are wired to seek emotional connections with one another. Emotional storytellers spark movements. They excite people. They inspire us to seek out innovative solutions to challenging problems. Emotion is the key to winning the future, and now science proves it. Ideas alone don't drive behavior. Ideas need storytellers to transport those ideas from one person to another. Let's stay back in history. For example, if we lived in Boston in 1773, we may have attended gatherings at the Old South Meeting House to listen to speakers like Samuel Adams, passionate advocate for the American Revolution and American independence. At the same time, a 19-year-old college student was mesmerizing the crowd with his speeches. His name was Alexander Hamilton. Scholars who study the writers and orators of the American Revolution have found examples of all three of Aristotle's appeals: ethos, logos, and pathos. The writers and speakers of the time provided clear and compelling reasons for separating the colonies from Great Britain, and they used classic storytelling techniques to ignite people's emotions. Storytellers spark movements. Let's stay back in history. If we travel to a British military hospital used to treat British soldiers in the Crimean War in 1856, we would have met this nurse. Her name is Florence Nightingale, and she had a passion for math and statistics. She began to analyze why more soldiers died from infections than battle wounds. At the time, most people didn't know that germs thrived in filthy conditions. Nightingale figured it all out, but she had a challenge. She had to get buy-in for her theory. So her challenge was making the complex simple enough to convince people. Well, get this, 150 years before Prezi was invented, or the first infographic was shared online, Nightingale created this color-coded pie chart. It was the first pie chart ever invented to represent data visually. And it worked. Nightingale not only pioneered data visualization, she's the reason why we have clean hospitals today. Let's keep traveling back in time, though. In 1860, you may have joined thousands of townspeople who came from miles around to hear this magnificent speaker, a storyteller, named Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln didn't climb onto a TED stage, he used a tree stump instead. But just like today's best TED speakers tend to do, Lincoln would use stories, storytelling to captivate his audience. According to a prominent historian who has studied Lincoln, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Lincoln's stories were contagious, and it helped him to win the election of 1860. She said crowds of villagers awaited his arrival at every stop for the chance to hear a master storyteller. Everywhere he went, he won devoted followers. Storytellers attract followers. Let's keep going back in time. In 1960, the majority of scientists were skeptical that America could put a person on the moon by the end of the decade. But recent scholarly work has found that John F. Kennedy's words and the way he delivered those words inspired people to find a way to achieve that goal. Scientists and citizens were moved to action because John F. Kennedy was a poet. He was a poet leader. He combined logical arguments and powerful storytelling to inspire people to dream bigger than they had ever thought possible. One of the reasons why JFK's words continue to resonate today is because Kennedy was a good editor. You can't be a good storyteller without being a good editor. On a visit to the John F. Kennedy Museum, the library in Boston, I was actually struck by the large number of edits that you can actually see on the original pages of the original speeches that Kennedy made. Those speeches now on display at the museum. His inaugural speech, delivered on January 20th, 1961, was the fourth shortest inaugural address in presidential history. And JFK wanted it that way. He actually told his speechwriter, "I don't want people to think I'm a windbag. Make it short." Well, think about it. Kennedy's speech was 13 minutes and 42 seconds. One of the greatest speeches in American history is 4 minutes shorter than a TED Talk. Sorensen, a speechwriter, had worked very closely with Kennedy for years and really understood how to articulate Kennedy's ideas. But despite Sorensen's gorgeous prose and how he wrote Kennedy's speeches, Kennedy made 31 changes to that script in the last few hours before he delivered the speech. And most were aimed at streamlining the language. You can see the edits, actually, if you look carefully, you can see the edits in red. Until the last minute, Kennedy was crossing out phrases, replacing long words and long sentences with short ones, and eliminating entire sentences. In fact, the most famous line even went through edits. Kennedy crossed out the word will and replaced it with can. He cut out several words too. So the sentence finally read, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." I once spoke to a data scientist who uses these enormously powerful computers and algorithms to analyze language. And he said Kennedy's sentence, that one line, is the most powerful and memorable sentence ever written. And Kennedy did not need a computer to figure that out. Again, storytelling and writing and communicating, a lot of this comes naturally to us. Storytellers launch organizations into action, literally. Our most significant historical events were triggered by writers and speakers, thinkers and leaders who mastered the art of storytelling to change minds. Today, storytellers around the world are still changing the world. And remarkably, today's storytellers are often inspired by the very storytellers who came before them. For example, Malala Yousafzai, the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, she grew up in a storytelling family. Malala's grandfather was famous for his sermons, and Malala recalls that people would come from far and wide to hear her father tell stories. Malala herself practiced and rehearsed. She entered public speaking competitions, and that's where she learned to deliver her message from the heart rather than from a sheet of paper, as she once said. The art of storytelling has become her most powerful weapon in the war of ideas. Ideas built the modern world, but ideas cannot spread without advocates to argue for them and evangelists to share them. In a world built on ideas, the storytellers, the people who can change and win hearts and minds, those are the ones who have a competitive edge. Here's the best part. We know how this works. We know how storytelling works, why it works, and we can prove it scientifically. At Princeton University, neuroscientist Yuri Hassan has done work into what he calls neural coupling. Hassan uses brain scans to study blood flow to different regions of the brain. He says when one person tells another person a story, the brains of both the speaker and the listener are in sync. Once the storyteller begins speaking, the brain activity of the listeners and the storytellers really becomes synced up to one another. Hassan calls it being aligned. Well, isn't that the goal of every pitch or presentation? To get your listeners aligned on the same page and in sync with your ideas. That's the goal. Dan Pink said, "We're all in sales now." I suggest we're all storytellers now. Neuroscientist Paul Zak says the brain loves good storytelling. He says a compelling story with an emotional trigger alters our brain chemistry. That means it releases oxytocin, which makes us more trusting, understanding, and open to ideas. In a few minutes, I'll show you what a well-constructed narrative looks like exactly. Storytelling works because we are hardwired to process our world and consume information in the form of story. Today, neuroscience provides the hard evidence to support this, what's been considered a soft skill. As a business professional, If you are not sharing stories, you're missing out on a tool, a valuable tool that is simple, proven, and effective. Storytelling is the edge you've been looking for. I've been studying the power of storytelling long enough to know that while the science is compelling, it's still difficult for many people to understand how storytelling specifically can help them become better leaders, more successful entrepreneurs, sales, or business professionals. So for now, let's shift gears, and I'll make the topic more practical. In a 5-year study of 5,000 employees and managers, UC Berkeley management professor Morten Hansen discovered that business professionals who rise to the top of their field are what he calls forceful champions. They're the ones who get buy-in for their goals and projects. He told me that communication and collaboration are key drivers of success in today's interconnected workplace. Successful business professionals communicate, persuade, and excite others. According to Wharton professor Adam Grant in his book Originals, an original is a person who champions a set of novel ideas that go against the grain, but ultimately make things better. You might be an original. You might have a novel idea, but those ideas are meaningless if a person cannot advocate for those ideas. Grant says if we want people to accept our original ideas, we need to speak up about them. We see this theme building and recurring. People who stand out in business today, and in every field really, have novel ideas and can convince other people to buy into those ideas. One of my favorite business storytellers of all time is Richard Branson, who I mentioned earlier. I had the opportunity recently to sit down with him to talk about storytelling and communication. Specifically, he told me that a compelling narrative can fit on the back of an envelope. And if it can't, keep working on the message until it can. I brought some materials. I want you to tell us what they all have in common, and I think you know where I'm going with this. I have a beer coaster. You have the beer coaster.
It looks like you're about to pitch an idea on a bit.
I have a napkin, a cocktail napkin. It has to be a small cocktail napkin, and I have an envelope. So I'll let you finish it. In your book, you say, if a pitch cannot do what, you're not interested.
Well, if it cannot fit onto a beer mat, a napkin, or the back of an envelope, then I'd rather listen to somebody else's pitch that can fit on. No, I think that most good ideas can be expressed very quickly. I mean, the old elevator pitch thing, I think it's true.
Mastering the art of storytelling is your most powerful weapon in the war of ideas. In fact, the winning formula behind TED's most popular talks is a story. My own research has shown that some of the most popular TED Talks are composed of 65% narrative. Those include personal anecdotes, case studies, or brand success stories. Famous TED Talks from educators like Ken Robinson, Sheryl Sandberg, Dan Ariely, those are made up largely of personal stories that reinforce the presentation's main themes. Human rights attorney Bryan Stevenson delivered an 18-minute TED Talk that contained 3 personal stories. Those in the audience were so inspired, they spontaneously donated $1 million to Stevenson's nonprofit called the Equal Justice Initiative.
She turned to me and she said, "Now, Brian, tell me what the Equal Justice Initiative is. Tell me what you're trying to do." I began giving her my rap. I said, well, we're trying to challenge injustice. We're trying to help people who've been wrongly convicted. We're trying to confront bias and discrimination in the administration of criminal justice. We're trying to end life without parole sentences for children. We're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to reduce the prison population. We're trying to end mass incarceration. I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired, tired, tired.
Let's break down Stevenson's TED Talk into that 3-part formula we talked about that Aristotle gave us 2,000 years ago. 65% of Bryan Stevenson's TED Talk fell under what Aristotle would have called pathos, emotion, storytelling. 25% logos, data to support the story, and only 10% ethos, which is building his credentials and experience. Success leaves clues. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know how persuasion works. And the most inspiring leaders, those men and women who people want to follow, are nearly always gifted storytellers. At least we think they're gifted. What we don't see is that they've worked at it. They've developed the skill of storytelling. They are CEOs and managers, sales, marketing, and HR professionals. They can be found at the top of companies in every field. They acquired the skills necessary to become effective storytellers. Warren Buffett once told a class of business students that improving their public speaking skills would raise their value in the workplace by 50% instantly. As a young stock advisor, Buffett took a course to overcome his terrifying fear of speaking in front of people. But he knew that becoming a strong communicator was crucial if he wanted to become successful. Buffett uses a number of storytelling devices, for example, analogies and metaphors, to make the complex simple. Buffett is especially fond of medieval analogies. He likes to say that when it comes to investing, looking for companies that are good investments are like an economic castle with a strong moat that prevents competitors from taking that castle. Buffett takes the analogy one step further, and he actually places a knight, a strong leader, as the head of the castle. In capitalism, he said, people are always trying to take the castle from you. So you want a moat around it, and you want a knight in that castle who is pretty good at warding off marauders. Buffett can actually barely get through a sentence without using an analogy or a metaphor. Well, those are the building blocks of story. He's a gifted storyteller, but as we now know, he worked at it. Success leaves clues. According to TED curator Chris Anderson, public speaking matters, and it matters more than ever. In his book, TED Talks, Anderson writes, as a leader or as an advocate, public speaking is the key to unlocking empathy, stirring excitement, sharing knowledge and insights, and promoting a shared dream. Isn't that what we're all trying to accomplish as sales, HR, marketing, and business professionals? Your goal is to create empathy, a bond of trust between you and your listener. Your goal is to stir excitement, share knowledge, promote a shared dream. Effective storytelling is the one skill that can help you achieve all of those results. In fact, I'll make the argument that you never would have heard of movements like Lean In, encouraging women in the workplace, had it not been for the power of story. While preparing for her first TED Talk on the subject, Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg did what came naturally to the former management consultant. She gathered mountains of data to prove her point. A friend of hers suggested that Sandberg should tell more stories about overcoming her own challenges as a working mother, and also tell stories about other people. Sandberg said she was reluctant at first, but she grew more comfortable telling those personal stories, and it's those stories that went viral. You see, data supports your product message, but stories drive your message home. When the rock star Bono gave a TED Talk on poverty, it had all of the elements that I look for in a great presentation. It had a theme, it had humor, well-crafted sentences and rhetorical devices, and of course all wrapped in this wonderful magnetic delivery, complemented by a beautifully designed Prezi presentation. There's also one moment in particular in the presentation that especially stands out, and it provides an excellent example of how to deliver data effectively by complementing that data with story.
Look at what's been achieved. Look at the pictures these data sets print. Since the year 2000, since the turn of the millennium, there are 8 million more AIDS patients getting life-saving antiretroviral drugs. Malaria, there are 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have their death rates cut by 75%. For kids under 5, child mortality, kids under 5, it's down by 2.65 million a year. That's a rate of 7,256 children's lives saved each day. Wow. Wow.
That's the logos, the data supporting Bono's theme. Watch what he does next. He uses story to give data its soul.
7,000 kids a day. Here's 2 of them. This is Michael and Benedicta. And they're alive, thanks in large part to Dr. Patricia Asamoah. She's amazing. And the Global Fund, which all of you financially support, whether you know it or not. And the Global Fund provides antiretroviral drugs that stop mothers from passing HIV to their kids.
Data reinforced Bono's theme. Stories brought it home. Neuroscience tells us that if you just listen to Bono recite numbers, you'll remember about 10% of the content. Add a photograph, however, and retention soars to 65%. An effective business story has a mix of data, charts, and pictures. Most speakers get so enamored of their data, they forget to tell and show the stories behind the data. Bono's presentation strikes the right note. Tell great stories, and you'll be far more persuasive than you've ever imagined. How specifically? Let's find out next. If we could have been in the room with Steve Jobs as he prepared to deliver his mesmerizing product launches, we'd have seen a masterful storyteller working his craft. It was a performance, not a presentation. A Steve Jobs keynote had all of the elements that you'd expect from a Broadway show. Props, characters, visuals, and a compelling narrative. What does a story have to draw you in, whether it's a play, a book, a movie, or a presentation? Today, I'll reveal the 3-part structure that all hit movies follow, and so do great presentations. How do I know this? How do I know it works? Because it's the storytelling structure that has been used since humans began telling stories to one another. All classic stories fall into these 3 acts. Act 1, the setup. Act 2, the conflict. And Act 3, the resolution. In Hollywood, the setup is where a movie's characters are introduced. We learn about their backstory. We learn about the hero's world before their adventure starts. In a business presentation, this is where you would describe the status quo. What is the current state of the industry in which your protagonist, the hero, your client in this case, what is the state that they are working in? In Act 2, that's where the conflict begins. This is where we introduce villains, hurdles, challenges. All great stories have a villain that the hero must overcome. David faced Goliath, Luke Skywalker faced Darth Vader. In a business pitch, the villain might be the problem in need of a solution. The hero is your product or your solution, or if you really want to get creative, you can turn the client into a hero who solves the problem. And finally, the resolution. Now, in a movie, this is where the villain is conquered and everyone lives happily ever after. But there's a difference between a story, a good story, and a great story. In a great story, the hero undergoes a transformation. They have to be a better person because of the experience they've had. Rocky learns he can go the distance. Luke Skywalker knows he has the Force on his side. In a business presentation, this is where you show how your customer's world will be transformed for the better because of your idea, your product, your service. Nobody did this better than Steve Jobs, the greatest business storyteller of all time. He was a master of the corporate narrative. For example, in 2007, Jobs introduced the first iPhone. He did not begin by telling his audience about the features of the product. Instead, he began with Act 1, the setup. That's where he talked about Apple's history of innovation and how a phone was a natural extension of what Apple had been doing all along. In Act 2, this is where he introduced hurdles and conflicts. He began asking questions like, why buy a smartphone from Apple? And here he introduces the villain in the form of a problem. He would ask, what's wrong with the current models? It's the interfaces, the plastic control buttons, the buttons and the controls, he said, can't change. How do we solve it? We've solved it by multi-touch. Get rid of all the buttons and make a giant screen. So what he's doing is asking these rhetorical questions to bring up problems and offer solutions. Jobs introduces stumbling blocks in Act 2 and then shows his audience how his product would overcome them. Act 3 is where the fun begins. See, now he can show off the product. Apple reinvents the phone, Jobs said, and this is where he introduced the new technology, multi-touch, and he took us on a tour of the product's features. Act 1, the setup. Act 2, the conflict. Act 3, the resolution. So here's the key. Great storytellers do not start with the product and explain its features. They begin with the backstory, the setup, then they enter the conflict, and finally the resolution. Inspiring others requires that you touch people on an emotional level. And one way to create such a connection is to create both negative and positive emotions in that order. Give your audience a conflict to overcome. That could be a frustration that they share, a problem to solve. And you can follow that by a sense of relief and joy that your product, idea, or service will help them resolve the problem. One of the reasons why I'm excited about working with Prezi is because its co-founder, Peter Arvai, is one of the most insightful experts on storytelling who I've ever met. In a panel discussion with Jason Katz, a storytelling supervisor at Pixar, Arvai said more presenters using Prezi see themselves as storytellers. They use Prezi and storytelling to stand out or get a great win. I want to help you get that win. Your ability to package ideas into an irresistible story that moves hearts and minds is the single greatest skill that will make you more valuable, more successful than you've ever imagined. Your story can change the world. Isn't it time you shared it?